Chapter 1, To Moscow with Churchill. I wonder if every diplomatic or military mission that journeys to a foreign capital to conduct important negotiations takes along someone to look for secret microphones. If only the walls of the guest house of the Soviet Foreign Office had tongues as well as ears. What a story they could tell. What a procession of statesmen politicians has passed through the portals of the compact little mansion on Moscow's dead alley in recent years. The list would begin with honest broker Pierre Laval, who came to Moscow in the summer of 1934 with a honeyed smile on his heavy lips and black treachery in his evil heart to sign the French-Soviet Mutual Assistance Pact. The following year, President Edward Benes came to sign a similar pact between Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, the implementing of which was contingent on the fulfillment of the Franco-Soviet Treaty. Then through the years, sundry American, British, Chinese, German, Finnish, Polish, and Turkish representatives. In the summer of 1939, it had accommodated the leaders of the British military mission that fumbled the world's last chance for peace. The negotiators were still deadlocked over the refusal to agree to Russian troops entering Poland in the event of a German invasion. The Russian press was still trying to transliterate the impressive moniker of the head of the British delegation, Admiral Reginald Plunkett Earl Drax, when Ribbentrop suddenly blew in with his suite and was put next door to the guest house in the former Austrian legation. The Nazi foreign minister promptly agreed that Russia should march into Poland when the Germans attacked from the west, thus meeting Russia's security requirements. Over the low garden wall, the British delegates could hear the noise of their new neighbors celebrating the signing of the Soviet-German agreement. The British left the next day in a state of nervous collapse. The following March, Finnish Prime Minister Risto Ryti, Juho Paasikivi, and the other members of the Finnish peace delegation stayed at the guest house while negotiating the termination of the Soviet-Finnish Winter War. Recent Finnish peace delegations, as well as Romanian and Bulgarian, have also stayed at the guest house. In the war period, it has accommodated numerous British and American representatives and visitors, including Lord Beaverbrook, Averell Harriman, Wendell Willkie, and Patrick Hurley. During the Hull-Eden-Molotov Conference of October 1943, the American Secretary of State stayed there. Friend, foe, and neutral have enjoyed the same unstinted measure of Russian hospitality while at the guest house. In August 1942, I stayed there with Averell Harriman and the other American members of the party who accompanied Prime Minister Winston Churchill on his first trip to Moscow. The Prime Minister was put up out of town in a sumptuous dacha, or summer house, and like a high Soviet official, was whisked back and forth between there and the Kremlin in a heavily curtained, bulletproof American limousine of the type Chicago gangsters made famous, so that the ordinary Muscovite never caught a glimpse of him. Harriman, Brigadier General Spaulding, Major General Russell Maxwell, then commanding U.S. Forces Middle East, his aide, Naval Lieutenant Sumner Girard, and I, in the role of technical advisor, were accommodated at the guest house. The day of our arrival, Girard and I were presented with a 4-page, typewritten list by the chef and asked to check the party's gastronomic preferences. Without distracting our superiors from affairs of state with such trivialities, Girard and I checked off the items we liked. The lavishness of the resulting menus would have been shocking anywhere, let alone in war-grim Moscow. Every meal consisted of at least 4 courses, and the table was always embellished with a huge basket of tempting fruit. Only with the greatest difficulty could we persuade our hosts that our party did not want champagne for breakfast. Once we invited the American press representatives to supper, and when they saw the food, especially the fruit, they asked us if we had brought our provisions with us. Many months later, when I had sampled Hotel Metropole fare, I understood why. Even the American embassy staff, and they are better off for food than the correspondents, not excepting the ambassador, Admiral Stanley, found meals at the guest house a real treat during the period of our 4-day stay. Thanks to Harriman's zipped lips, virtually no news leaked out during the actual Churchill-Stalin talks in Moscow. Churchill avoided the press completely. Only after we had flown back to Cairo was the curtain of censorship lifted to let out the bare fact of his visit. Churchill's press conference back in Cairo was singularly uninformative, consisting mostly of generalities about how well he and Stalin had got along with each other. Not till later did the gossip gradually leak out about the unfavorable impression caused at the Kremlin banquets by the Prime Minister's appearance in a siren suit. The Russians are sticklers for form. by his grumpiness during the toast-making, and by the unceremonious way he sat on his own ambassador, Sir Archibald Clark Kerr, when the latter proposed a toast to Stalin's health. Churchill told Sir Archie that, as ambassador, he could address himself only to Molotov, the foreign commissar. That first Churchill visit to Moscow coincided with the low ebb of Allied diplomatic and military fortunes. On the Russian front, Sevastopol had fallen after an 8-month siege. The Germans were pushing ahead in the Caucasus and beyond the Don elbow toward Stalingrad. Rommel was on the threshold of Alexandria. In the Far East, the Battle of the Solomons was raging indecisively, while the Japs had gained a foothold in the Aleutian Islands. Feeling in Russia was bitter over the failure of the Second Front to materialize, despite the promises presumably made to Molotov on his trip to London and Washington. So bitter was it that members of Allied military missions who appeared on the streets in uniform were jeered by the population. Jokes were passed about the Anglo-Americans having established their second front in the front row at the ballet. While official circles withheld their comment, the papers were full of reports of mass meetings by labor groups and leftist organizations in Britain and America, petitioning for the immediate opening of a second front. There was little effort at sober evaluation of second front possibilities in terms of forces and, more particularly, shipping. The Russian people did not know that out of a convoy of 48 ships bound from Murmansk in June 1942, 45 had been sunk, and that when as much as one-third of a convoy managed to get through, it was considered a good showing. They also tended to overlook or minimize the heavy Allied naval commitments in the war against Japan. However, such oversights are understandable in view of the fact that the Nazis were still gnawing their way deeper and deeper into Russia's living flesh. The turning in the road was not yet in sight. The long, bitter agony and slaughter of Stalingrad was still ahead. Before the two men and the countries they stood for could trust each other, either militarily or politically, there were many suspicions and misunderstandings that needed clearing up. Stalin had not yet forgiven the British for Munich, when the Chamberlain government, so the Russians thought, had virtually invited an anti-Soviet coalition of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. While Churchill's stand in favor of the fascist puppet Franco in the Spanish War, ill-accorded with his present role as leader of a democratic coalition to fight fascism and Nazism. They also remembered Churchill's role as a prime instigator of intervention in the Russian Civil War. Too, the Russians were still deeply suspicious of the Hess episode. They were convinced that Hess had flown to Britain, not on his own, but as Hitler's emissary in a bid to enlist Britain's support for his forthcoming anti-Soviet crusade. The Russians resented British reticence on the subject, and the fact that Hess was getting what they considered lenient treatment ill-suited to his guilt as one of the top war criminals. In the Kremlin mind, there still lurked the suspicion that the Hess request for a de facto armistice in the West had been granted, and that Britain might even now, as on previous occasions, be playing a double game, encouraging both Russia and Germany to exhaust each other while she stood on the sidelines preparing to reap the spoils. Was not that what the London Poles, who had the support of the British government, were openly hoping for? General Anders, commander of the Polish forces in the Soviet Union, had, with British approval, declined to fight on the Eastern Front alongside the Red Army. The lack of a second front confirmed these gnawing doubts, and added to the growing seriousness of the Russian position on the Eastern Front, came as near as anything ever came to shaking the Man of Steel's confidence in ultimate victory. Churchill, for his part, deeply resented the Russian failure to comprehend and appreciate the British war effort, their constant sniping on the Second Front issue, their failure to give the British people due credit for weathering the grim months of the Blitz, when they alone defied the conqueror with unbroken spirit in the face of seemingly hopeless odds. He had not forgiven the Stalin-Ribbentrop Pacts, nor the period when Russian policy seemed oriented toward Germany, when Russian wheat and raw materials helped the Wehrmacht, when the communists in Britain and elsewhere sabotaged the war, so he thought, at Moscow's bidding. On the basis of the reports of his own military experts, Churchill had fully expected the Russians to collapse in the first few months of the German invasion. Even now, despite the admittedly heroic show they were putting up, he was by no means sure they could or would continue to hold out. He, like Stalin, was haunted by the specter of a separate peace. A few months before he left London, Churchill had talked to General Anders, just come from Russia. Anders, as commander-in-chief of the Polish army in the east, had enjoyed unusual opportunities for travel and observation inside the Soviet Union. What he had to say confirmed the prime minister's worst suspicions. The Russians were at the end of their resources. Transportation and internal economy were in complete chaos. Morale on the home front was cracking. By the end of the summer, the Germans would be beyond the Volga. At the same time, they would complete the conquest of the Caucasus. Baku, with its oil, would be theirs. It was on this basis that Anders sold Churchill the plan for pulling his Polish troops out of Russia, where they had been trained and equipped with the help of the Red Army for eventual service on the Russian front. If they stayed on in Russia, Anders argued, they could not affect the issue. The country was already foredoomed to defeat. They would simply be needlessly sacrificed for a lost cause. But if they were pulled out of Russia in time, they could strengthen the garrison of the Middle East against the inevitable day when the Germans would bear down from the Caucasus. Churchill not only agreed to the Polish exodus from Russia, he was so impressed with what Anders had to say about the imminent peril of a German attack through the Caucasus that he switched large Indian forces to Iraq and Persia out of Burma. On his way through Cairo, Anders had told the same story to the 30-odd generals and 80-odd brigadiers who garrisoned British GHQ Middle East, and had thoroughly convinced them too. At that time, he and most of the other government Poles were full of the expectation, unconscious product of their wishful thinking, that Germany and Russia would destroy each other completely like the Kilkenny cats, leaving a vacuum into which the Poles might march and re-establish Greater Poland to the Dnieper. Later, when it became all too evident that Russia would not be destroyed, many of these same Poles conceived the necessity for a war between Russia and Poland and the Western powers and shifted their tactics accordingly. That was in the winter of 1942 to 43. But in the spring and summer of 1942, the Poles were still confident that Russia would be defeated, and they were doing their level best to convince the British and Americans. That was the real purpose of General Anders' trip direct from Russia to Cairo and London. Presumably, he had come to negotiate with the Allies for uniforms and equipment for his army. The Russians had even provided him with a special plane for his trip to Cairo. It waited 2 weeks to take him back and then flew off without him. Anders never did return to Russia, and in due course the Russians learned what he was really up to. Against this background, small wonder both Stalin and Churchill resorted to strong language. Neither man is used to mincing words, and it was almost 20 years since Stalin had spoken to any statesman of equal rank. Churchill, though his tenure of office had been shorter and his power more circumscribed, is in his way as domineering and intolerant of opposition as Stalin. And now he was up against a man whom he could neither bully with his strength nor mesmerize with his eloquence, strained as it was through a flannel-mouthed interpreter. At those meetings in the 0 hours during his 4-day stay, Churchill, in conformity with Stalin's custom of doing all his heavy work at night, arrived at the Kremlin around 11 and stayed on till 5 o'clock in the morning. The PM stormed a bit. Stalin kept coldly calm, though his steely surface sometimes gave off sparks. The British aristocrat and the Georgian cobbler's son were like positive and negative currents of the same high voltage. But though their background, training, outlook, and temperament bred antagonism at almost every point, historic necessity and their common hatred for the Berchtesgaden paperhanger held them together. In the end, Stalin was made to understand just why the Allies could not invade France for some time to come. He was told about the forthcoming North African expedition, which would have to serve as a second-best second front. The Soviet marshal was far from satisfied, but thereafter the Russian press noticeably abated the second front needling campaign, all but Ilya Ehrenberg, that is, whom no one seemed able to silence. Churchill, for his part, received assurances that the end of the German advance in Russia was in sight and that the Kremlin had no intention of negotiating a separate peace. The little that he saw of the Red Army and of the spirit of the Russian people during his visit seemed to confirm these assurances, and almost grudgingly he revised his estimate upwards. The two men, though they could scarcely be called bosom friends, at least understood and respected each other now. The anti-Hitler coalition had weathered its first severe political crisis,